On July 4th, a date traditionally reserved for fireworks, barbecues, and nonpartisan reflections on liberty, President Donald Trump introduced something starkly different. A military-style parade that would transform the National Mall into a theater of hard power. Billed as a celebration of America, the event quickly evolved into something more polarizing, a visual manifesto of Trump's brand of nationalism, saturated with symbols that sparked both fervent applause and fierce alarm. The official name, Salute to America, evoked reverence and patriotism, but the visuals told a more complex story. Massive armored tanks lined the streets near the Lincoln Memorial, their treads purposefully placed on protective rubber mats to prevent damaging the asphalt, a metaphor, some would later argue, for how fragile the democratic infrastructure had become. Fighter jets tore across the sky, trailing red, white, and blue as Trump stood beneath towering teleprompters and a wall of bulletproof glass. What was traditionally a day of unity now felt like a referendum on presidential identity. Was this about honoring American troops, or was it an assertion of power, a personal spectacle designed to glorify one man? That question hovered uneasily in the air, just blocks away from the parade grounds. A very different crowd was gathering, holding cardboard signs etched with the words, "No kings, we fought a war to end this, and this is a republic, not a runway." Protesters flooded the sidewalks. Many were veterans, historians, and everyday citizens, alarmed by what they saw not as patriotism, but performative authoritarianism. The phrase, "No kings," wasn't chosen at random. It was a deliberate callback to the American Revolution, to the very principles that separated the U.S. from monarchies and tyrannies. The stage was set, one side wrapped in flags and fighter jets, the other wrapped in the Constitution. This wasn't just a parade, it was a national mirror, reflecting to opposing ideas of what America should be. The pageantry of Trump's parade was overwhelming by design. Two M1 Abrams tanks, weighing over 60 tons each, stood still but spoke volumes. Surrounding them were Bradley fighting vehicles, Apache helicopters, and stealth jets, weapons of war now transformed into props for political theater. It was a display of military aesthetics rarely seen on U.S. soil during peacetime, one that sparked comparisons not just to Bastille Day in France, which Trump reportedly admired, but to Soviet and North Korean military pageants where power is always personified. Trump stood at the epicenter of it, isolated behind armored glass, like a monarch in a modern-day throne room. The address he delivered struck patriotic chords, honoring figures from American history and the armed forces. But many noted how frequently the speech centered around Trump himself. Applause lines were timed, cameras were fixed on his face, and chants of USA often bled into Trump. From the crowd, it was less about the republic and more about the man who claimed to embody it. The optics were carefully curated, televised for mass consumption, framed as a spectacle of strength. Yet the message, for critics, was not one of national pride, but of political bravado. Trump, who had often admired strongmen abroad, now staged his own version of state spectacle, one where military symbols legitimized civilian power and blurred the line between national celebration and political endorsement. Conservative commentators framed it as a return to pride, an antidote to what they saw as years of national self-criticism. But others including military veterans and constitutional scholars, issued warnings. This wasn't the first time a republic used military displays to rally national identity. They pointed to Rome before Caesar, Weimar before Hitler, and Venezuela before Chavez. History has shown that the slide from celebration to centralization often begins with a show. Meanwhile, everyday citizens watched with a mix of awe and unease. Children waved flags as jets roared above, but their parents quietly questioned why taxpayer money, reportedly millions, was being spent to fuel a display many saw as more campaign than commemoration. In short, the parade was not just a display of America's might, it was a manifestation of Trump's worldview, where leadership is showmanship and where patriotism and personal loyalty blur. It left the nation asking, was this truly a salute to America, or a subtle signal that the era of the People's Republic was giving way to the rule of personality? As tanks rolled toward the National Mall and the president prepared to speak behind layers of security, a quieter but equally symbolic movement gathered momentum just beyond the barricades. With hand-painted signs, American flags held upside down, a distress signal, and pocket-sized copies of the Constitution raised in defiance. The No Kings protesters weren't there to disrupt the parade. They were there to remind the nation what it was originally built to resist. This wasn't an angry mob or a radical fringe. Among the demonstrators were veterans, historians, students, and lifelong patriots, many of whom carried a different vision of America, one rooted in civic restraint, institutional humility, and fear of concentrated power. Their rallying cry, "No Kings," didn't come from partisanship. It came from history. The phrase traced back to the American Revolution, when colonists rejected King George III's tyranny and envisioned a republic governed not by spectacle or might, but by consent and law. These protesters believed that Trump's parade, with its tanks and tributes and elevated stage, wasn't merely a celebration of independence, but a performance of power that risked becoming imperial in tone. One woman held a sign that read, "We broke away from Britain for this." Another man, a Vietnam veteran, wore his old fatigues and carried a banner that said, "I fought for the Constitution, not a crown." Some simply stood silently, hands over hearts, backs turned to the parade. Others chanted lines from George Washington's farewell address, in which the first president warned against personality cults and entangling foreign alliances. Media outlets at first brushed off the protests as minimal or symbolic, but as footage spread online, the visuals struck a chord. These weren't radicals, they were guardians of civic tradition. Their quiet presence told a powerful story. True patriotism is not always loud. Sometimes it stands off to the side, holding a sign that simply says, "Remember who we are." The protests didn't call for the end of America, they called for its recentering. In the eyes of the protesters, the tanks weren't the problem, the elevation of the presidency above the people was. The fight wasn't against power itself, but against the pageantry of unchecked power masquerading as patriotism. At the core of this historic moment lay a deep ideological divide, one that went far beyond tanks and protest signs. On one side was Trump's vision, a bold, dramatic celebration of national strength, meant to inspire awe and remind citizens of America's military and economic might. On the other was the protesters' warning that democracy is most fragile not when attacked from the outside, but when subtly reshaped from within. To Trump and his supporters, the parade was an unapologetic affirmation of American exceptionalism. It showcased triumph, sacrifice, and power, all the hallmarks of a resurgent nationalist pride. Supporters cheered not just for the military, but for a vision of America that was confident, assertive, and unashamed of its dominance. In their view, the critics were out of touch, obsessed with political correctness and blind to the importance of national morale. But to his critics, and especially to the No Kings protesters, the event wasn't just a flag-waving spectacle. It was a symptom of a deeper political transformation. To them, this was not a celebration of the Republic, but an erosion of its norms. The very act of centralizing attention, resources, and media focus on one man surrounded by weapons of war felt less like patriotism and more like personality worship. The debate wasn't over love for country. Both sides claimed to be the true patriots. The real conflict was over the definition of patriotism itself. Was it about revering military strength and honoring a powerful leader? Or was it about defending the principles of balance, restraint, and institutional humility? Historians pointed out that America had always wrestled with this tension. The Founding Fathers distrusted standing armies. Presidents like Eisenhower and Truman warned about the military-industrial complex. Even Abraham Lincoln, in wartime, went to great lengths to distinguish his personal authority from the ideals of the Union. The parade, they argued, ignored those warnings and in doing so, signaled a dangerous normalization of executive pageantry. This clash wasn't just political. It was philosophical. One side viewed dissent as disloyalty. The other viewed dissent as the highest form of loyalty. One side believed strength lay in power. The other believed strength lay in accountability. It was, in essence, a battle between nationalism and democracy, and in that moment, both claimed the flag, but not both could claim the future. As the echoes of fighter jets faded and the tanks were towed away, the battle over perception had just begun. The media, already polarized by years of culture wars and Trump-era divides, splintered into two camps almost instantly. Right-leaning networks hailed the parade as a long-overdue tribute to the armed forces, framing it as a moment of American pride finally given the grandeur it deserved. Anchors praised Trump for reclaiming patriotism from what they perceived as decades of liberal cynicism. On the other side, progressive outlets sounded the alarm. Editorials compared the visuals to authoritarian regimes, glossy tanks, choreographed flyovers, a president shielded by glass and flanked by generals. Some headlines questioned whether America had entered its bread and circuses era where entertainment and power displays masked democratic erosion. Commentators noted that the cost of the event, estimated in the millions, came at a time when military families struggled with housing and veterans lacked basic health care. Social media became a battlefield of its own, flooded with contrasting images, some showing families smiling under fireworks, others showing protesters holding signs beside riot police. Hashtags like #salute to America trended alongside #NoKings and #This is not normal. Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok became echo chambers, amplifying tribal loyalties rather than bridging understanding. Public reaction was equally fractured. Polls taken in the days after the event revealed a nation split along familiar line supporters viewed the event as patriotic and powerful, while detractors called it excessive and dangerous. But what stood out most was the indifference of many Americans. To them, the debate felt abstract and other culture war skirmish in a never-ending political saga. Yet historians and civic leaders warned, when the public becomes numb to symbols of power, democracy slowly slips through the cracks. Internationally, the spectacle did not go unnoticed. In Europe, coverage was mostly cautious, with newspapers asking if America was turning inward and away from its democratic ideals. In Russia and China, state-run media mocked the display as hypocritically accusing the U.S. of acting like the very regimes it routinely criticized. The irony wasn't lost on global viewers. The world's oldest democracy now appeared to flirt with monarchy's old stagecraft. To understand the full meaning of Trump's parade and the No Kings protests, one must return to the origins of the American experiment to 1776, when a group of revolutionaries broke from the British crown, not just to gain independence, but to reject the entire idea of centralized hereditary power. The U.S. Constitution was built with layers of checks and balances, precisely to avoid what they had fought against: a single man standing above the people. Since then, American presidents have walked a careful line. Washington refused to be called Your Excellency. Jefferson rejected grand ceremonies. Even Lincoln, at the height of the Civil War, was careful to speak of the people's union, not his own power. That ethos, humility in leadership, suspicion of spectacle, became a cornerstone of the American political identity. But moments of crisis have always tested that boundary. In times of war or social unrest, leaders have been tempted to lean into pageantry and strength. The difference, historians argue, is in intent. Franklin D. Roosevelt led with fireside chats. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a former general, avoided military displays out of respect for civilian rule. Trump, by contrast, appeared to revel in the performance-making, himself not just the speaker of the event, but the event itself. The No Kings protests understood this history. That's why their message carried weight, not because it was loud, but because it was ancient. The fear was not about tanks or planes. It was about precedent. If a president can turn a national holiday into a personal pageant, what comes next? Personalized oaths, loyalty pledges. The erosion doesn't happen overnight. It happens through tradition being redefined, slowly, with applause. Some compared the moment to Rome before its fall, when republic faded into empire and ceremonial displays became the norm. Others pointed to Napoleon, who crowned himself in defiance of the Pope, signaling that he would be emperor by his own hand, not by divine or democratic grace. In each case, the transformation began with symbols and the public's willingness to accept them. Trump's parade, in this light, was not just an event, it a test of how much the nation remembered and how much it was willing to forget. And the No Kings protesters, with their humble signs and historic warnings, reminded America that the Founding Fathers didn't just write about freedom. They warned us exactly how it dies. In the months and years that followed Trump's military-style parade, its echoes continued to reverberate, not just in political debate, but in the symbols and ceremonies that define the American presidency. For some, the parade became a bold statement of national pride, a moment when a president reasserted strength in the face of global doubt. For others, it stood as a chilling reminder that the slide from republic to ruler often begins not with the bang of laws overturned, but with the slow normalization of spectacle over substance. What could not be denied was this: the parade broke precedent. It redefined how a president could use a national holiday. It reframed patriotism through the lens of militarism, and it sparked a new movement of citizens deeply concerned with the preservation of American Republican values. The No Kings protesters did not fade. Instead, their slogan gained traction across civic circles, universities, podcasts, and classrooms, becoming a generational warning against the seduction of power wrapped in flags. The impact wasn't only symbolic. Future administrations now faced a question: would they continue this model of muscular nationalism, or would they return to quieter, more humble commemorations of independence? That answer would define not just policy, but the emotional architecture of American democracy. Meanwhile, civic educators, veterans groups, and historians began revitalizing public discourse around the meaning of the Republic. More people began reading Washington's farewell address. Books like On Tyranny and How Democracies Die surged in popularity. Across the country, a hunger returned not for parades, but for principles. And perhaps that is the paradox of Trump's parade. In trying to dominate the narrative, it accidentally sparked a counter-movement grounded not in anger, but in memory. The memory that America was built not by tanks or slogans, but by restraint, argument, and a fierce belief that power must always answer to the people, whether history will remember that day as a tipping point or a footnote remains to be seen. But the battle it revealed between showmanship and statesmanship, between power and principle, is far from over. It plays out every election, every holiday, every time a leader steps before a podium. And for those who still whisper "No kings" beneath their breath, the message is clear. True patriotism doesn't seek a throne, it safeguards the freedom to protest one.